Our topic today is a rather sobering one, lament, suffering, and Christian flourishing. And to get us started, I want us to consider two, hold on, PowerPoints. I want us to consider two uh, catastrophic events in our fairly recent history here in the United States, the destruction of the Twin Towers and the explosion of Mount St. Helens. Now, both of these events have some similarities. These were both kind of iconic, nationally known destinations, and they both fell to kind of these fatal and fiery and traumatic disasters uh, that were, of course, well documented. And so we have these horrifying images like the ones that I have on the screen. And both of them left behind a kind of visual carnage that was really almost as striking as the events themselves. And in both cases, people looked at the devastation and wondered if anything could be done to restore, things, to heal things. And so I want you to imagine that you were tasked with restoring these sites of devastation. What would you do? And if you stop and think about it, I think here is where the two devastations really part ways, because in the case of the Twin Towers, there was nothing left to do with the rubble except haul it away. Uh, the devastation was simply destructive. And so your task would be just to try to find ways to cart off all those smoldering bricks and twisted steel girders, because those were simply things that got in the way of restoring. But in the case of Mount St. Helens, the situation is really kind of interestingly different. The debris from the eruption, things like fallen trees and melted snow and volcanic ash and buried foliage, was actually the starting place for recovery, for reforestation. These things weren't carted away. Instead, they became the starting point, the raw material with which to create something that now is quite beautiful. They had a job to do. And so within 15 years, the site of Mount St. Helens was already a thriving forest. And what foresters noted is that the trees were unusually tall because the ash had kind of done away with some of the competing weeds and foliage. And so after the trees had grown, some other vegetation started growing in the enriched soil, and they also did very well. And then wildlife started returning. And by 1997, an Audubon Society study had actually found more species of birds in that area than there were in the 1980 pre-eruption study of that same region. So the difference between rebuilding or restoring the Twin Towers in Mount St. Helens is pretty simple. One disaster left debris that was simply in the way, and the other left debris that was generative, that actually contributed to healing, that led to this kind of flourishing ecosystem. Now, I want us to think about this a bit as therapists. I think a lot of times we look at the wreckage in our clients' lives, the damage that's been done by trauma and suffering, and we see it as if it were the debris that's left over from the destruction of the Twin Towers. It's simply in the way. We need to remove it. We need to take care of symptoms. And so we just need to get rid of it so that healing can start in our clients' lives. But what I want to propose to you this morning is that traumatic life events and the damage that results from traumatic life events is more like Mount St. Helens eruption. That the things that are left behind in people's lives can be and should be viewed as generative. And in fact, your most important task as a therapist may be not to move people as quickly as possible out of those spaces of suffering, but rather to take people through the ashes of their suffering and help them to make it fertile soil for a new and flourishing life. So, like a volcano, difficult life events, one of the things they do is they really shake up and disrupt our sense that our life is meaningful. And so this is really one of the most difficult things about suffering, is that it's completely disorienting. Often people say things like that life doesn't make sense, their important goals might be disrupted, their plans for life, and depending on the severity of the suffering, people might even wonder if they're the same person that they were before the difficult life event. And so what we need to do with the debris of our suffering is put the pieces back together, hopefully in a new and better way, which in the field of psychology we refer to as meaning-making coping. So what is the difference between suffering that leads to flourishing and suffering that leads simply to more suffering? Well, from a psychological perspective, we might say that it depends on the quality of the meaning-making that the individual goes through. From a theological perspective, we might say that it depends on whether, as we are rebuilding, whether we structure our meaning within the framework of God's meaning. And back to the psychology, one of the things that research tells us very clearly is that there is actually a strong connection between suffering and flourishing, a connection that's so strong that it led one prominent positive psychologist, Laura King, to refer to suffering as the hard road to the good life. The hard road to the good life. Now, perhaps this idea that suffering might lead to good things shouldn't be such a surprise to those of us who are on this Zoom meeting, because it's also an idea that's found very clearly in the Bible. Now, the Bible does not confuse evil with good, but what it does, and what it does consistently, is set suffering in a broader and higher meaning context, the context of God's providence and God's purposes. In other words, in the context of God's meaning. So in spite of its origins in the fall, suffering is, to our great benefit, bent to the purposes of a benevolent God, a God who loves us and wants good things for us. The classic verse that describes the situation is Romans 8:28, which reminds us that God works all things together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Now, we know this in our heads, but I think that one of the reasons that we often don't take this perspective seriously, that we don't kind of naturally gravitate toward this, is because we are surrounded by a culture that defines happiness, flourishing primarily in terms of our own good feelings. And so if we think about flourishing in this really simplistic way as feeling good feelings and not feeling bad feelings, then that does make flourishing the opposite of suffering. So it's really problematic when we buy into this perspective. It's problematic for our lives. It's problematic for the lives of our clients. So when we're primarily concerned with just eliminating our suffering, what we do is we miss out on the chance to benefit from our suffering, to engage in it in that way that leads to good outcomes. So let me try to explain why this is the case. And in order to do this, I'm going to be drawing on psychologist Crystal Park's meaning-making model. And Crystal Park begins this model by outlining a process that individuals engage in when they encounter difficult life events by distinguishing between two kinds of meaning. The first of these is global meaning. And so there are several components of global meaning. Global meaning consists of one's core beliefs about the world and our place in it. In conservative Christian circles, we often refer to this as our worldview. Global meaning also encompasses our important life goals. And the third component is simply that feeling that life has meaning and purpose. If somebody asks you, is your life meaningful? If you say yes, that's what this global meaning is referring to. And the global meaning system is very important. Meaning is important to all human beings. We could not function without some kind of system of meaning because we use it to interpret all of our life experiences. We use it to act in the world, to make decisions on what we're going to do next. It guides our actions. So this is where situational meaning comes in, because when we encounter a difficult life event, we are going to, again, we're meaning-making creatures. What we're going to do is we're going to appraise the meaning of that stressful life event. We evaluate the meaning of that life stressor. Some of the types of evaluations we do are we sense how threatening, how uncontrollable the life event is. We might try to figure out why it is that the event occurs. We might think about what the implications are for our future. And so all of these things, all of these ways that we appraise the meaning of the situational stressor is what Park refers to as that situational meaning. And here's the key insight from Park's meaning-making model. The insight is that the degree to which our appraised meaning of the event differs from or is discrepant from our global meaning is going to determine the level of our distress. Let me say that again because it's a very important point. When we hit difficult events in our lives, part of our suffering is really tied in with the event itself. So if we lose somebody, there might be grief associated with that. If we have illness, there might be physical pain. If someone betrays us, there's anger. But as if that was not enough, the ground beneath our feet also shifts because our meaning is fractured. Well, if we appraise the event in a way that differs from our global meaning system, then this means that our assumptions about ourselves and our world and the place in our world are challenged. And so people just kind of report feeling lost. They're not quite sure how to understand things, how to proceed with life. So there's a discrepancy, and the discrepancy results in distress. So, for example, about 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. And it was a shocking diagnosis. I was faced with the threat of losing my life. My children were young teenagers at that point. I was faced with potentially leaving my children without a mother, my husband without a wife. And so here I was facing this situational stressor. And I had this global meaning system as a practicing Christian that said that God is good. But my situational appraisal, my situational meaning was that the cancer was going to be this potentially destructive force in my life and in my children's and husband's lives. And so there was a discrepancy there. And there was distress associated with that discrepancy. And part of my struggle, in addition to just facing all the things I had to do to deal with the cancer, was to try to understand how to pull together these two things: God's goodness with the destructiveness of the cancer diagnosis. And so moving through suffering requires a process of rebuilding meaning, what Park calls the meaning-making process, in order to try to resolve this discrepancy between global and situational meaning, because resolving this discrepancy can restore a view of the world as meaningful and life as worthwhile, and it can also lead to growth. And this is where the good news comes in. While extremely painful, the rebuilding of our meaning systems is also an opportunity because it's a chance to build a better and stronger meaning system. And a stronger and better meaning system can help us to form a better life. It can lead us to increased flourishing. From a theological perspective, God can redeem our suffering. This is one of the important ways that He does this. And so we can rebuild our meaning system with a clear vision of what life is about, what's important, what can be left behind, who we really are, et cetera, et cetera. So under the right conditions, meaning making can lead to the discarding of unhelpful beliefs or untrue beliefs. It can lead to leaving behind misguided goals, values that are not conducive to flourishing, and then adopting a new and better way of understanding the world and our place in it. For example, the naive belief that some people might hold as part of their religious system that God won't allow any suffering to people who trust God might give way to the better belief that suffering is going to come, but that God can redeem suffering. And I would also add here that even when the global beliefs and goals are fairly solid to start off with, that the meaning-making process can cause these to become more complex, more nuanced. It can cause us to internalize our beliefs about God and God's goodness more fully, et cetera, et cetera. And again, when our meaning-making process results in a successful resolution of the discrepancy between the global and situational meaning, this allows us to incorporate that suffering into our life narrative, into our life story in meaningful ways. And the psychological research suggests that the more complex, the more nuanced our meaning making is, that the better off we are. Simplistic ways of viewing the world and our suffering tend to lead to impoverished lives. Now, I hope you're hearing me clearly. I'm not saying that suffering always leads to good things, because the meaning-making process can also lead to poor outcomes. In our attempt to reconcile our global and situational beliefs, sometimes we might actually discard beliefs that are actually true or that are helpful, and this might lead to worse mental health outcomes. So, for example, people might believe in God's goodness and power and existence, but then might stop believing in those things when suffering comes their way. It's one way to reconcile that discrepancy. Not a good way, but it is one way of doing it. Or important life goals might be left behind, discarded, but without adopting any new goals, leading to a kind of sense of purposelessness. And we all know that that is not conducive to flourishing. Or people might simply get stuck in that meaning-making process. They just keep spinning their wheels, and the result is ongoing distress. So let me just be very clear about this. Suffering itself does not cause growth, as is sometimes simplistically assumed. What suffering does is it provides the opportunity for growth, but the quality and the kind of meaning-making is what is going to facilitate or hinder growth. And this has a very important implication for those of us who try to come alongside people who are suffering, that it's a mistake to skip the process of meaning making. I think in our Christian world, sometimes we think that we need to jump to some triumphant place very, very quickly and don't allow ourselves really the space for this processing of the suffering that is so very, very important. Now, one important part of our global meaning system that I want to spend a bit more time on are the ways that we think about suffering itself. So our global beliefs about suffering, what it is, what causes it, what it's all about, et cetera, et cetera. Because when we have robust ways of thinking about suffering, what we might call a robust theology of suffering, then those beliefs can then inform our situational beliefs. When we do encounter hard things in our life, we have kind of this background set of beliefs about suffering that we can draw on, that we can pull on as we interpret the hard things that come into our lives. So how we conceptualize our suffering matters. And there has been some really interesting psychological research on how different ways of thinking about suffering, and specifically different, what we might call religious or quasi-Christian beliefs about suffering lead to different outcomes. One study, for example, by Wilt et al., found that different views of suffering in college students resulted in changes in patterns of religious engagement 1 year later. So this was a longitudinal study. And what they found is that if people have the view that God shares or comes alongside us in our suffering, or the view that God has benevolent purposes for our suffering, then 1 year later, there was increased commitment to their religion and increased involvement in their religion. But if at the beginning of the year they had views that God has limited power or benevolence, what we might call open theistic views, that God has limited foreknowledge, then what happened is that 1 year later, we saw the opposite pattern of changes. There was decreased commitment to their faith and decreased involvement in their faith. And the same study showed that these pre-existing views of suffering, their global beliefs about suffering, became accentuated when people experienced religious or spiritual struggle, when they hit a hard patch in their faith, when they appraised that. Their pre-existing tendencies got accentuated. So if they started off thinking that in general God had purposes for their suffering and was with them in their suffering, then when they hit hard times, they experienced God in more positive ways. But if they started off believing that God maybe isn't benevolent or powerful, or that he doesn't have foreknowledge about suffering, when hard times hit, they actually had more negative experiences of God in their suffering. Now, so far we've been talking about the consequences of our beliefs about suffering for our relationship with God, but these beliefs also have consequences for well-being. So another study by McElroy and Heltzel found that benevolent views of suffering in the context of the 2016 Louisiana floods, that these helpful beliefs buffered the relationship between global belief violations and PTSD symptoms. In other words, when people have global belief violations, as as per the model, when there's this discrepancy, we would expect them to have greater PTSD symptoms. But when people had benevolent views, views that God has benevolent control over suffering, views that God suffers along with those who suffer, views that God uses suffering to build people's characters, then there was less than distress than might be predicted. So, having benevolent views of suffering, having a good theology of suffering, serves as a protective function when we hit hard times. Now, to this point in my talk, we've discussed the relationship between suffering and flourishing. And I suggested to you, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, that there's actually evidence theologically and psychologically to think that there is a strong connection between suffering and flourishing, and that this connection has to do with meaning making. Okay, so that's where we've arrived so far. And here's where the third part of my talk comes in. Here's where lament comes in. So, what is biblical lament? Well, it's a practice. It's I would say a powerful spiritual practice. And the way that it is helpful is that it helps us to rebuild fractured meanings in a way that is going to draw us to God. And so it's something that as Christians we can avail ourselves when we face suffering. And I would suggest that it's also something that we can recommend to our Christian clients. So it's a structured way of engaging with God in the context of suffering. It's found throughout the Old Testament, but in its clearest form, it's found in the Psalms. Some scholars estimate that up to 40% of the Psalms actually fit in this category of Psalms of lament. And it's referenced, these Psalms of lament are referenced extensively in the New Testament, including by Jesus when he was facing his own suffering on the cross. As you might imagine, my own interest in lament came out of my own experiences just wrestling with God during my own long, hard year of cancer treatment. And I didn't actually know that what I was doing had some kind of biblical precedent until I ran across this really interesting book by theologian Todd Billing, Rejoicing in Lament. And I've been happy to see that in more recent times, there have been more mentions of lament on the internet and sometimes in churches. But it really is a practice that needs to be encouraged more and more in our churches because it's almost disappeared from our contemporary Christian context. So this is where a lot of my current work is in trying to develop and evaluate uh, what we might call interventions, lament-based interventions for use in Christian settings. And as a psychologist, what I'm really fascinated by is the uniquely Christian meaning-making function of lament. As I've said several times already, suffering disrupts our sense of meaning, and that's why we have to engage in meaning-making coping. And what lament does is it facilitates the creation of new meaning by providing a kind of narrative structure or arc for our meaning-making narrative. So from a psychological perspective, what it does is it moves us through a trajectory that provides some support for us being able to arrive at a place of new meaning. It moves us from the threat of meaninglessness, from the chaos of shattered worldview assumptions to a rebuilt worldview. And a couple of things that are really important about this trajectory is that it's a relational trajectory. It's not just about abstract cognitive knowledge, but it's moving us from a place of struggle with God to a place of trust and surrender to God, and from a focus on ourselves and our own struggles to a focus on God. And so let me briefly walk through the structure of lament with you. I'm going to be using one short Psalm of Lament, Psalm 13, to illustrate the different elements of the structure of lament. So lament always begins with the address to God by crying out to God because by definition, it's prayer, it's engagement with God. The whole purpose of lament is to bring our suffering to God. And in this way, lament differs in some important ways from other ways of dealing with our suffering. It's not just lonely catharsis. It's not just writing, in a journal somewhere about our suffering. It's not just getting our feelings out there. It's also not grumbling behind God's back, but it's bringing all of our experiences, including our very difficult ones, to God. So the address is going to be very important. And one thing I want to mention here is that there are a number of ways in which the psalmists cry out to God, a number of different names that they use to cry out to God. But here's where kind of our Christian perspective, looking back at the Psalms of Lament from the New Testament, brings in some rich additions. Because one of the things that was modeled for us by Jesus, and that we were encouraged in our use of by Paul, was to come to God as our Father, and not just as kind of some big distant Father, but as our Abba Father. And so when we come to God to bring God our the difficulties in our lives, we can do it being confident that we're bringing it to a God who is our loving Heavenly Father. In the second part of lament, what we're going to do is we're going to just bring the cause of our suffering before God. And when you look through the Psalms of Lament, it's really kind of amazing how many things show up that psalmists are bringing to God. So we find complaints about physical suffering, about disappointment in life, depression, people who have hurt us, people who have let us down and abandoned us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one of the and loveliest, most interesting things about the complaint is that often God Himself is the focus. I've given you a few examples here on the PowerPoint, but the psalmists are often saying, God, where are you? God, if you love me, then why is this happening to me? And so it does seem very, very clear that nothing is off limits when it comes to expressing our suffering to God. We can express to God our doubts about God or anger at God. There are psalms that express just hatred, enemies, and so what's modeled for us is that we can express honestly whatever is in our hearts. And I think this is really remarkable because if you stop and think about honesty in the context of your other relationships, there are often boundaries, maybe subtle boundaries, but there might be power differentials that limit how kind of raw you are in your honest expressions to others. We might be concerned about the well-being of others, and so we pull back. We might be afraid of the reactions of others, but we don't have to do any of these things in our relationship to God because God alone is big enough to deal in absolute honesty with what is in our hearts. Now, this step, the step of bringing our suffering to God, again, is very important because this is where we are processing our suffering cognitively and emotionally. And as I said earlier, this is necessary for growth to occur. In fact, there's some evidence that the time that we spent sitting in our suffering is crucial, that the amount of growth we experience is directly related to the amount of intentional engagement with the suffering. So again, let me draw out the implication for our Christian clients especially. It's problematic when they want to jump too quickly to that triumph at the end of the story. We need to try to help them stay in those places of wrestling with their suffering. Now, while avoiding our suffering is helpful, neither is it helpful to get stuck in it. And this is where the third element comes in, the request. And here God is acknowledged as the one who can actually do something about our suffering. And so when we ask God to act, we're reminded that God can act in these situations. And this is important because hope then comes into the context. And without going into the research here, there's abundant research that one of the most powerful things that we can help our clients with is instill them with a sense of hope in the difficulties that they are going through. And then the last component of lament is that expression of confidence in God, the praise. And so here we find that narrative arc that I mentioned earlier that's completed. And one of the things that's really interesting about this last part of lament is that it can sometimes seem really abrupt. There's this very small word that you'll notice at the beginning of verse 5 here, but, and this occurs in most of the Psalms of Lament. And it's a kind of line that's crossed. It signals a shift in focus from one that's centered on the psalmist and the psalmist's own pain to a shift on God. And I've read commentaries about these, and these theologians are don't really know why this shift occurs. Some of them speculate perhaps that God has already acted, and that's why the psalmist can come back in praise. But my own sense in sitting with a lot of people who have gone through suffering is that there is a shift here that happens that's not external, but that it is internal. And so I think that what's happening is that when we do these early parts of lament, when we bring our suffering into God's presence, when we uh, express to God what our suffering is, when we ask God for help, that what we're doing is we're surrendering our suffering to God. And I think that that surrender is what is really, really important in the context of suffering. I think that as Christians, we consider ourselves to be surrendered to God. We might intentionally try to practice surrender to God, but based on my experience and the experiences of many people I've spoken to, we don't ever quite realize how tightly we're clinging to our sense of autonomy, self-determination, this illusion that we have control over our own lives until we hit the wall and face our helplessness. And if we are wise, then that is going to lead us to taking our lives and really surrendering it to God and realizing that the reality is that we are finite creatures, that were created for a dependent, loving relationship with a God who cares for us. And so when we surrender, we are able to enter more fully into that relationship. And so this is where the arc of lament becomes complete, moving from calling out to God through complaint and request to surrender, and then finally to worship and praise, which is really the appropriate response to the kind of God that we worship. And let me end with a quote that I love from Eugene Peterson. Many of you know Eugene Peterson, who passed away fairly recently. And he says that this is the lesson of the Psalms, that all true prayer pursued far enough will become praise. It does not always get there quickly. It does not always get there easily, but the end is always praise.